studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican fraternity and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
and Charles Richard.
And Charles, welcome to the studio, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. We've already discussed a little bit about this movie that you had us watch, and I'm so interested. Obviously, not being from Cajun culture, it's really been an interesting experience to watch it. And I'm going to let you say the name so I don't botch it up.
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah, and this is a fun topic. I'm very glad to be here to talk about it. So 2026 marks the 40th anniversary of the release of, I think what most people would agree is one of the most important movie depictions of Cajun culture ever, and that is Belizaire the Cajun, which was written and directed by Glenn Petrie. He's from the Bayou Lafourche area of Acadiana, so well to our east on the other side of the Atchafalaya Basin, and very much a working man's son. He was from a shrimping family out there, and Glenn went on to become educated at one of the Ivy League schools, and he was known briefly as somebody who was making Cajun spaghetti westerns. So I've never seen one of those, but those were some of the films that he was working on in his early days. And what really made them stand out is that they were some of the first or only movies to be made in Cajun French. Belizaire comes along in 1986, and that film is mostly in English, which also includes a lot of Cajun French as well. But it's a fun story, and it enjoyed its own respectable measure of success when it came out. It played at the Cannes Film Festival, where it was, I think, very warmly received by French audiences who really appreciated a kind of overlooked chapter in the history of post-colonial French culture here in Louisiana.
I certainly didn't know anything about that part. I'd heard, from going to Vermilionville, I watched the documentary on Acadie and the whole, movement from Nova Scotia.
That's right.
Which is now.
Mm-hmm.
But I had not thought about or heard about this aspect.
Sure. Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Acadian culture dates back to the 1600s, and these were folks colonists who all came from a very tight, small region in France, the maritime provinces of France. And these were families that had all been living together for generations and generations. You can go and find the local church parishes with the headstones. And so they didn't come as a scattering from all over France, most of them. They all came from the same neighborhood. And these were families that had been interacting and intermarrying for generations in Europe, fleeing a lot of the religious wars and persecutions that were happening in France at the time. These are families that took the opportunity when it was offered to come to the New World and settle in the maritime peninsula that we today call Nova Scotia. Originally it was called Acadie. And so these French settlers, they stand out in North American history because unlike other European settlers, they really didn't have conflicts with the native peoples who were here. The Indian tribes that were in the same place that they were settling were the Mi'kmaq Indians, and the Mi'kmaq had been converted to Catholicism by missionaries from Quebec, and so the Acadians settled right alongside them and became not only good neighbors, but also intermarried because both were Catholics. And both groups, the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians, both bitterly hated the British, especially in times to come. But it's very fair to say that the Mi'kmaq Indians deeply influenced the Acadians who settled there. And of course, after many generations, some folks in New England decided that the land of that's now Nova Scotia was really very desirable farmland. And part of the constant warfare between France and England led up to what is called the 7 Years' War. Most of us in American history books learned it as the French and Indian Wars. So when you talk about that, the French were the Acadians and the Indians were the Mi'kmaq. Long story short, the French Empire lost that war in North America, and they lost virtually all of their territories in North America. And the Anglo-American settlers came up from New England and settled in Nova Scotia by driving off the existing populations there and driving them into exile. A great many of them, there was a deliberate attempt at ethnic cleansing. So they didn't want to just simply move the people off the land. They wanted to scatter them all over to disperse their identity as a people. These folks living in exile eventually learned that they might be welcomed by the Spanish government that was governing Louisiana at the time. And so right around the early 1760s, 1765, a group of these Acadian exiles, the ones who had survived the whole thing, found their way to Louisiana. The Spanish welcomed them as fellow Catholics, and they especially liked the idea that these folks really hated the British after their experiences. So they were given land grants out here in what was then a very remote part of the Louisiana colony. And that's the sort of prairie region and bayou regions of present-day Acadiana. And so they settled there and lived in relative isolation for a long time until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and you started to have a large influx of Anglo-Americans into the region. And this renewed a lot of those pre-existing tensions, over language, over culture, especially the clash between Catholic and Protestant, English and French. There were lots of other cultural differences that you could catalog. But when the story of Belizaire the Cajun takes place, it's the 1850s, it's the story of these two groups coming into contact with each other in the frictions. Because they lived so far away from cities and other large settlements, there was really very little in the way of law enforcement, government, or even church presence. So when Belizaire the Cajun opens, there's only recently been a church built and a priest dispatched to that area. For me, what's most interesting about the film are those folk Catholic aspects of it.
And it opens up right at the beginning with a scene in confession. So, and it's really interesting because Belizaire is trying to negotiate his way out of 5 whole rosaries, which seems to him excessive.
Yes.
He does get it knocked down to 1.
Yeah, well. So Belizaire is a kind of a stock character, like an archetypal character in Cajun folklore, as well as in the folklore of a lot of different cultures. He is what folklorists would identify as a trickster hero. And so Belizaire, he's kind of a leader among the people for several reasons, but Belizaire doesn't accomplish things through, force and strength or combat or anything like that. Instead, he gets by on his wits, his cleverness, and his ability to outsmart opponents and ultimately make fools of them. And that makes him one of the most infuriating enemies for these newly arriving Anglo-Americans.
I.e., maybe Socrates and so forth.
Yeah.
Almost like not so much as, well, he was a bit of a trickster too, but the idea of making a fool out of people didn't go
sit
well.
It didn't go well. It didn't sit well at all. And the scene you just mentioned is one that stands out in a lot of people's minds, because it opens up with Belizaire, like you say, in the confessional, and the newly arrived priest has just assigned him a penance of 5 rosaries, and Belizaire looks up and kind of looks at the screen, of the confessional, and says, 5? Nay, Father, never in my whole life have I ever been given a penance of more than 3 rosaries. And the priest is played by a local attorney named Alan Duran, and I know him, and a lot of us. He's kind of well known in the community. Everybody calls him Sprinky, and the priest says, "Well, no, Belizaire, the penance comes from God, not from me." He'd say, "Okay." So Belizaire leaves the confessional booth, and a few minutes later, the priest does too, and he kind of follows Belizaire out, and he starts complaining to Belizaire about his shoulder. Now, Belizaire is what is called a traiteur. That's roughly comparable to a kind of medicine man in some indigenous communities. And so he was a healer, and a traiteur, which translates as a treater, somebody who treats illnesses and wounds and so forth. In the Cajun tradition, he's an herbalist, uses natural elements of the environment, but it's all dependent on the essential aspect, which is prayer. And so he has a role in that community, especially in the absence of a priest or doctors in those days, as a kind of spiritual leader as well as a medicinal person. So that priest comes out, he says, "Belizaire, man, my shoulder's acting up again. You got any of that liniment that you gave me last time? Seemed to really work." And Belizaire says, "Well, Father, I got one last bottle of it, and it's already set aside for Widow Cormier or whoever." And he says, "So I can't really give you any." He says, "I could make you some. I could make another batch, but I don't know that I'm going to have the time being on my knees saying 5 rosaries." So back and forth they negotiate, and that's a theme throughout the movie, is trying to negotiate trades. And what's interesting to me is that not only is Belizaire a figure of folk Catholicism as a healer and a spiritual leader in the community, but it also reflects a certain understanding, or maybe a better way to say is misunderstanding, of Catholic doctrine back then. In the 1850s in South Louisiana, there was a big influence of Jansenist heresies and so forth. And in the minds of the ordinary lay Catholics, there was a certain, I don't know how to put it, a certain economy at work when it came to salvation. You do enough penances, erase your sins, you do enough good deeds, and there was a kind of equivalence in the minds of many of those Cajuns at that time about the trading and negotiation of spiritual good.
I wonder, did that come from maybe, I don't know, I know that there was a lot of trading in the French and Indian area. I mean, it seems like it was just built into some of the culture too. Trading in general was part of more of a culture than we understand it now because of the monetary, system we have and not trading. That's
a really important point, and this is something that's been emphasized a lot by Louisiana scholars, Cajun scholars like the historian Carl Brasso or the folklorist Barry Ossolet, is that for the Acadians, they really didn't build their society around the kind of monetary systems that we're accustomed to, and certainly not the kind of monetary systems that the Anglo-Americans built their society around. Cajuns got by through trade and bartering, whether it was goods or services or an understanding that the community relies on sort of a certain mutual benefit. And that did indeed play a big part in the kind of Catholicism they practiced.
You're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio, Radio for Acadiana. We are your Third Order Dominicans, your lay Dominicans, here with our show, and that is Studium to Studio, and we're here every Thursday at 4 p.m., thanks to Stein Lumber, with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And today we're venturing into the arts. And some people say, well, isn't this some sort of Dominican show? How does this relate to Dominicans? Well, the arts is something that the Dominicans take very seriously, whether it's music, whether the music that you'll hear on the out with a little bit of
Hillbilly Thomas.
Yeah, Hillbilly Thomas, or Fra Angelica with beautiful visuals. So today, we're blessed to have one of our Dominicans, Dr. Richard, to talk about the movie Belizaire the Cajun, celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And so, in looking at the early credits of the movie, I saw one name pop up that I was kind of shocked, because it was a big time name, and here in this movie, what's the connection there?
Yeah, so the name that I think you're referring to is probably Robert Duvall. And again, the movie was made in 1986. Robert Duvall was indeed a very high-profile figure in Hollywood. People knew him from everything from The Godfather to Apocalypse Now and hundreds of other, well-known and very successful commercial movies. So I'm not exactly sure how or when it happened, but at some point, Robert Duvall took a strong interest in South Louisiana. And with Belizaire coming out in 1986, it was only a few years later that, I think in the 90s, Robert Duvall returned for his own independent film to be made in South Louisiana, in which he played a Protestant preacher who was really struggling with, with the sins of his own life. And it's a very moving story. It was very personal to Robert Duvall, and it was made here in South Louisiana. So I'm not exactly sure how he came to have the connections that he did to Acadiana, but yeah, Robert Duvall was one of the big movers behind this. And he has an uncredited role in the film when there's a death, a murder, among the Anglo-American settlers. There's a funeral, and there's a Protestant preacher who is delivering the service for that and reading from the Bible, and that is played by Robert Duvall. He's not credited with the role. I think that's probably because that meant that he would have had to be paid union wages, and that was a lot bigger budget than our friend Glenn had money for the film. But I think the other big connection is that the female lead character in the film is a woman by the name of Alida Thibodeau. And Alida Thibodeau was played by Robert Duvall's wife. I certainly didn't know that at the time, but she's easily the most prominent character in the film after Belizaire.
Right.
And she plays beautifully this role, especially, when you consider that Belizaire is being played by a non-Cajun actor. He's played by Armand Desante, who is, a very prominent name, respectable name for any film to attract an audience. And played opposite of him is, oh my goodness, I've forgotten her name, but I want to say Gail Youngs, I believe. Anyway, in any case, she was married to Robert Duvall, which also brought that connection home as more personal. She does a fantastic job. Both of them do, Belizaire and Alida. interpreting Cajun cultures as non-natives. And that credit has to go not only to their talents as actors, but to Glenn Petrie, the director, in coaching those performances.
And you said many of the extras, though, were locals.
Oh,
right?
yeah, that's right. I mentioned the folklorist Dr. Barry Ossolet a few minutes ago, and he was one of the folks who appears in the production. There's a lot of extras in the movie, and those are all played as much as possible by local people, dressed in period costume. It was all shot right around this area of Lafayette Parish. You'll see that the courthouse or the sheriff's location in courthouse is designated as Vermilion Parish, but Vermilion Parish was a much bigger place than it is today. So, it is about as authentically local as it gets. And what I think I admire most of all, and there's so much to admire in this film, is the absolute strict adherence that Glenn made in representing authentic Cajun culture and history. So this is an area of specialty of mine, is the study of South Louisiana culture and history. And watching the film, it's astonishing to me to see any film on the big screen that gets it as right as this movie does. Hollywood films never do, but this is one remarkable exception.
So one thing that I noticed in the movie when we were talking about the marriage between Alida and the Anglo
Matthew Perry,
mm-hmm. and the fact that because you were mentioning that there weren't many priests around and so forth, some people wouldn't consider them married legally, except that she says, no, we jumped the broom. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So again, South Louisiana was one of the more remote places in America at the time. And the Cajuns, part of the reason they were able to retain their cultural identity for so long is that isolation. And it was a long time before Acadiana had priests. I was speaking with an elderly priest today. He's a friend of mine, and he was telling me about how his mother, I believe they were from Cameron Parish, which even today is very remote. He was saying that how his mother remembers that a Catholic priest would arrive in their community once a month on horseback, and that was to say Mass, hear confessions, and that was about as much as they saw of him. And so everything else that needed to be done in terms of spiritual leadership and moral guidance and so on and so forth, that was kind of left up to the lay people themselves. And as I said, folk Catholicism is it's the manifestation of Catholic beliefs and practices by ordinary lay Catholics of a given culture. And it reflects their best understanding or interpretation of Catholic teaching as it's been brought to them. So sometimes folk Catholicism gets it wrong, frankly, when it comes to some Catholic teachings, and that's quite understandable. But it's also a long-standing part of the Church's missionary history that wherever it goes, it tries to embrace the existing cultures of the people that are being evangelized. And as long as those cultural beliefs and practices are not in conflict with church doctrine, the church's general policy has been to tolerate them. And so that's what you see represented in this film. Now, I don't think that there was anything that got Catholic doctrine wrong in this case. But it may be unfamiliar to, say, folks in the 1850s in Mexico practicing Catholicism, where they had their own version of folk Catholicism. We know that the blending of Africans and French Catholics in Haiti, what's called Haiti today, was the colony of Saint-Domingue, those produced some syncretic religions that we would identify today as voodoo. But it's important to point out that even figures in New Orleans, the most famous, of course, was Marie Laveau. Marie Laveau was a daily communicant. She attended Mass at the cathedral every day. She was regarded as a voodoo priestess, but that's an example of what happens when you begin to have these cultural mixings and the ordinary folk embrace Catholicism, not so much as a body of rules and doctrines in a book, but as a way of life. And culturally, that's what gives the richness and variety to the Catholic or universal Christian church.
And we were talking before the show that, part of the church in its wisdom embraces the cultures that we begin to reach out to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a beautiful thing. And then we can see that in the Blessed Mother, how she comes to all the cultures as one of their own, right?
Yes, like Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Right,
Yeah.
and Our Lady of Lavong, and Our Lady, and all the cultures, Our Lady comes as a mother of that culture. And that's sort of how the church views these things. And we spoke about, the words like Easter, which doesn't, it was, now we know what it means to us as the season of the Paschal mystery.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll notice in other cultures, not in English, doesn't have a meaning, Easter. It's more Pasch, the Pasch.
Yes, that's right.
Which is all of Easter.
And I don't know exactly how it came to be, but the word Easter is derived from the name of a European pagan goddess of springtime and renewal. Catholicism oftentimes is a blend of the magisterium, the scriptures and the official traditions of the church and teachings, with how those things are lived out in the daily lives of ordinary people and the cultures that they are part of. And Belizaire represents that very well. A big part of the conflict in that story is between the incoming influx of wealthy Anglo-Americans who are, by and large, they're Protestant, and conflicting with the Catholics in Acadiana. And the Anglos were organizing vigilante groups that, if you watch the film, they are very reminiscent of a sort of predecessor to the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, of course, they didn't like Catholics. They didn't like Cajuns. The vigilante groups that were working to drive out many of the Acadian families they didn't like, well, it's because they wanted their land, which was good land. And although the movie makes no reference whatsoever to the Acadian exile that we talked about earlier from the area of Nova Scotia, that threat of exile was something that struck a deep note of fear and anger in the people that were being driven out by these vigilante groups.
My understanding of even the Protestant Revolution or Reformation, depending on how you want to say it, was because of the desire for land, even in Germany, and really Martin Luther was just used as a pawn because they wanted to acquire the land. So you kind of see the background is really nefarious, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And this is what I think of when the church uses the term the mystery of iniquity, because among both the Catholics and the Protestants, behind all of the hullabaloo about the differences in religious doctrines, it often comes down to ordinary human characteristics like greed, lust, and all of the other 7 deadly sins, anger.
Back to the garden.
Exactly.
So remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard.